Welcome, my dear friends. Pull your chair a little closer and let the world outside grow quiet, because today I have a story for you that begins not with a scream, not with a chase, but with the slow, solemn tolling of ancient church bells. It is a Sunday morning in the English village of Ashford Crossing. The bells are ringing, the congregation is gathering, and somewhere among those familiar, respectable faces, a murderer is standing with folded hands, looking perfectly innocent. A man is found dead in the churchyard, and the great Hercule Poirot finds himself in a village where everyone has a secret. Everyone has an alibi, and the bells, it seems, were kind enough to ring at exactly the right moment. This is Murder Under the Shadow of the Bells. Let us begin. The village of Ashford Crossing. The village of Ashford Crossing was the sort of place that appeared on no important map, and yet those who lived there considered it the very centre of the world. It sat quietly in the folds of the English countryside, some 40 miles southwest of London, cradled between low hills and a river that moved so slowly in summer it seemed to be thinking things over. There was one main street, a post office that smelled permanently of brown paper and old rubber, a public house called the Three Crowns, a small lending library, open only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and, at the far end of the lane where the elms grew thickest, the Church of St. Bartholomew the Less, a grey stone building of considerable age and very little warmth. It was the sort of village, Hercule Poirot thought, as his hired motor car rattled over the narrow stone bridge on that pale September morning where nothing of consequence ever happened. And yet, here he was. He adjusted his hat, smoothed the lapels of his overcoat, dark grey, exceptionally well pressed, and permitted himself a small sigh. He had come, in truth, not because of any murder, for there had been no murder yet. He had come because his old friend, Dr. Ephraim Hollowell, had written to him in late August, saying that the village was not quite right, and that he would value Poirot's company for a few days. Dr. Hollowell was not a man given to fancies. If he said a thing was not quite right, one listened. The motor car deposited Poirot and his single leather case, the rest of his luggage having been sent ahead, at the gate of Hollowell Cottage, a square-faced house with roses that had gone slightly wild, and a brass knocker in the shape of a fox. Hollowell himself opened the door before Poirot had finished walking up the path. "Poirot, good Lord, you actually came. Did you doubt it, mon ami? I half expected a telegram saying you'd gone to Paris." "Paris," said Poirot, stepping inside and removing his hat with great care. "Can wait. You, apparently, cannot." Ephraim Hollowell was 71, lean and slightly stooped, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades watching people pretend to be healthier than they were. He had been the village doctor for most of his adult life, and now in retirement still served as something between a medical advisor and a confessor to roughly half of Ashford Crossing. He knew things about people. That was both his gift and, Poirot suspected, his present trouble. Over tea. Very strong, very English. Nothing whatsoever like what Poirot would have preferred, the old doctor explained. "It is Gideon Hartley," he said. "And who is Gideon Hartley?" "The most respected man in the village. Churchwarden for 20 years, generous to charities. Sits on the parish council, knows everyone, is liked by everyone, or so it appears." Hollowell paused, turning his cup. 3 months ago, a young woman left the village without a word of explanation. Agnes Poole. She was a seamstress, lived in rooms above the bakery. One morning, she was simply gone. "People do leave villages," said Poirot, though his eyes had sharpened. "They do, but Agnes Poole had told Mrs. Farrow at the post office that she was afraid. Those were her words, afraid, and when I asked what of, she would not say." Hollowell set down his cup. "And last month, old Tom Birch, the verger at St. Bartholomew's, told me that he had seen Gideon Hartley arguing with someone in the churchyard at nearly midnight. He could not see who the other person was. 2 days later, Tom Birch tripped on his own doorstep and broke his wrist. Now, men do trip, but Tom Birch has walked that doorstep for 40 years. Poirot was quiet for a moment. You think Gideon Hartley is dangerous? I think, said Hollowell carefully, that Gideon Hartley is hiding something, and that in this village, where everyone talks and no one says anything, I cannot find out what it is. You, however, he smiled, a dry and weary smile. You have a way of making people speak. Poirot did not smile back. He was thinking. Tell me, he said at last, about the others. The people around this Hartley, and so Hollowell did. There was, first, Mrs. Constance Hartley, Gideon's wife. She was 63, quietly dressed, quietly mannered, a woman who had over many years perfected the art of being present without being noticed. She arranged flowers for the church every Friday, ran the Mothers' Union with brisk efficiency, and, according to Dr. Hollowell, had not smiled, truly smiled, in longer than anyone could remember. A marriage, then, that is not entirely happy, said Poirot. I couldn't say, said Hollowell. She has never complained. Not once. Not to me. Not to anyone. Then there was Roger Ashby, who owned the small estate at the edge of the village, Barton Grange, a handsome house in need of repair. Ashby was 45, a widower, educated, mildly charming, in the way of men who have learned charm as a practical skill. He had been in some difficulty financially, or so the rumor went, though he was careful never to show it. He and Gideon Hartley had been, until recently, friends of some standing. Lately they had been seen to avoid one another. Over what? Asked Poirot. Money, possibly, or possibly something else. There was also Miss Eleanor Vane, who taught the infants at the village school, and was 40 years old, and had never married, though not. Poirot understood, for want of admirers. She was clever, perhaps too clever for Ashford Crossing, and had a talent for observation that she exercised quietly and never boasted of. She had been seen, on more than one occasion, watching Gideon Hartley with an expression Hollowell could only describe as calculating. And finally there was the Reverend Martin Fossey, the vicar of St. Bartholomew's, a mild, bookish man of 55, who preached competent sermons and kept excellent records of parish births and deaths, and who was, in Hollowell's opinion, concealing a private sadness he had carried for years without ever putting down. Poirot listened to all of this without interruption, save to ask once whether there was any more tea. There was. He accepted it without complaint, which for him was a considerable sacrifice. And this Sunday, said Hollowell, there is the feast of St. Bartholomew. The whole village will be at the church. The bells are to be rung, a full peal, 6 bells for nearly an hour. There will be a service, a parish lunch afterwards in the church hall. He looked at Poirot. It seemed to me a natural moment for you to observe. Everyone will be together. In a village this size, if something is wrong, it will show itself eventually. In my experience, said Poirot, it shows itself rather sooner than people expect. He was right, of course. He generally was. But even Hercule Poirot, who trusted his little grey cells above all earthly things, did not anticipate quite how soon. He spent that first day, a Friday, walking the village. He was, he told anyone who asked, a friend of Dr. Hollowell's, visiting for a few days' rest. He said it with such convincing weariness, dabbing his forehead with a beautifully folded handkerchief, that no one thought to question it. He visited the 3 Crowns at noon and drank a small glass of something he did not entirely trust, listening to 3 men at the bar discuss the forthcoming ringing with the seriousness most people reserve for affairs of state. He learned that the chief bell ringer was a man named Arthur Poole, the brother, he noted, of the vanished Agnes, and that Arthur had taught half the ringers himself and was considered the finest campanologist in the district. He walked past the church in the late afternoon when the light was amber and the shadows long. The churchyard was well kept, with old yew trees and newer headstones standing at the usual uneven angles. A stone wall ran along 3 sides. The 4th side opened onto the lane. There was a small gate in the far wall, almost hidden by ivy, that led into the field beyond. Poirot noted it carefully. He stopped outside the lich gate and looked up at the tower. 6 bells, he had been told. In the old days, bells had rung for plague and for victory, for funeral and for festival. Indifferently. They did not distinguish. They simply rang. He thought about that for a moment. Then he put on his hat. The wind had found an unhelpful angle, and walked back to Hollowell Cottage for supper. He met Gideon Hartley the following morning at the post office, where Hartley was collecting a parcel and making conversation with a large, comfortable ease that Poirot found, on reflection, slightly too comfortable. Hartley was 67, broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and the steady gaze of a man accustomed to being believed. He shook Poirot's hand firmly. "Hollowell's friend? Yes. He mentioned you'd be about." "A detective, I'm told. Retired," said Poirot pleasantly. "Quite retired. I investigate nothing more troubling now than the breakfast menu." Hartley laughed. It was a good laugh, easy and warm. "Well, you'll find nothing to detect here in any case. Quiet as anywhere in England." "So I understand," said Poirot, and he smiled, and he watched, and he said nothing more. But walking away, he turned Hartley's laugh over in his mind. It had been perfectly timed, perfectly weighted. The laugh of a man who had, at some point, decided exactly how to laugh in public, and that, in Poirot's experience, was never a good sign. The dead man in the churchyard. The bells of St. Bartholomew's began at 9:30 on Sunday morning. Poirot heard them from his room at Hollowell Cottage, a deep, rolling cascade of sound that seemed to come not merely from the tower, but from the earth itself, rising up through the old stone walls of the village and settling into the chest like a second heartbeat. He stood at the window in his dressing gown, listening. There were 6 bells, as promised, and the ringers were good. The pattern was clean and mathematical, each note falling precisely where it ought to, the whole thing building into something that was almost, but not quite, music. He dressed with his usual care. This was not vanity, or rather, it was not only vanity. A well-dressed man, he had always found, was a man people looked at briefly and then dismissed. And a man who was dismissed could observe a great deal. By 10 o'clock, he was walking up the lane toward the church, the September air cool and faintly damp, the yew trees casting their long shadows across the path. Other villagers moved in the same direction. Couples, elderly women in good coats, a few younger families with children who had already been told twice to walk properly. Everyone going the same way, everyone dressed for occasion. Poirot fell into step, some distance behind the Hartleys. Gideon Hartley walked with his wife on his arm, but it was the walk of habit rather than affection. 2 people who have performed the same motion so many thousands of times that it has become entirely automatic. Mrs. Constance Hartley wore a coat of dark blue wool and a hat with a single feather. She was looking straight ahead. Her husband was nodding to people as they passed, calling out names, touching the brim of his hat. The good churchwarden, the respected man, the centre of the village. Poirot watched him and thought, yes, and also something else. Inside the church, the pews filled quietly. St. Bartholomew's was cold in the way only very old churches manage to be cold. Not merely the absence of warmth, but the positive presence of chill, as though the stone had spent 8 centuries absorbing it and now offered it freely to all comers. There were flowers on the altar, white chrysanthemums, and something yellow Poirot could not name, arranged with the severe precision he had come to associate with Mrs. Hartley. He took a pew near the back, beside Dr. Hollowell, and looked around. Roger Ashby was 3 rows ahead, alone, sitting with the contained stillness of a man making an effort. He had the look, Poirot thought, of someone who had slept badly and was determined that no one should know it. He did not turn around when Gideon Hartley entered and took his place at the front. though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was aware of the exact moment it happened. Miss Eleanor Vane sat across the aisle from Ashby, in a good coat of dark green, her hands folded in her lap. She was not looking at the altar. She was looking, with an expression of careful neutrality, at the back of Gideon Hartley's silver head. The Reverend Fosse appeared from the vestry, and the service began. The bells had stopped now. The ringers, Poirot understood, would be resting in the ringing chamber, the small room at the base of the tower, accessible from inside the church, but with its own door to the churchyard as well. Arthur Poole among them. Agnes's brother, who had said nothing publicly about his sister's disappearance, and who, according to Hollowell, had become in recent months a man of very few words. Poirot opened his order of service and read it without reading it. He was, in truth, not thinking about the service at all. He was thinking about the small ivy-covered gate in the churchyard wall that he had noticed on Friday. It was perhaps 30 yards from the south door of the church. It led into the field beyond, and from there he had established by a quiet Saturday afternoon walk onto the back lane that ran behind the houses of the High Street. A person could, in theory, leave through that gate and be entirely invisible from the lane at the front. He was thinking about this, and about the arrangement of the pews, and about the expression on Roger Ashby's face, when the service ended and the congregation began to move toward the door. The bells had started again. The second peal, the recessional ringing, traditional to the feast day. Poirot stepped out into the churchyard with the others, blinking slightly in the pale September light. The bells overhead, enormous and insistent, and swallowing every other sound. People gathered in small clusters, as English people do after church, exchanging words, making plans for the parish lunch, complimenting the flowers. Children ran. The vicar stood at the door shaking hands. Everything was entirely ordinary. It was Mrs. Farrow from the post office who found him. She had gone, she said afterwards, to sit on the bench by the far wall, the stone bench under the old yew, where she always sat after the feast day service, because her feet troubled her, and it was a shorter walk back to the hall from that end of the churchyard. She had gone there, and she had found Gideon Hartley. He was lying on his back among the long grass beside the wall, some 10 feet from the ivy gate. His eyes were open. His face wore an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been nothing at all. It is difficult, in death, to read these things accurately. There was no visible wound, no blood. He looked, Mrs. Farrow would say repeatedly in the hours that followed, as though he had simply sat down and then lain back and decided to stop. But he had not decided anything. The small bruising at his throat, faint but definite, told its own story. Gideon Hartley had been strangled. Mrs. Farrow's cry was not loud. The bells swallowed it almost entirely. It was only because Poirot happened to be standing some 20 feet away, his attention already drawn by something he could not quite have named. A gap, a missing element in the texture of the crowd, that he heard it at all. He reached the bench before anyone else. He stood very still and looked at Gideon Hartley for a long moment. Then he crouched, carefully, with some discomfort, for his knees were not what they had been, and looked more closely at the throat, at the hands, at the position of the feet. He did not touch anything. He simply looked. Then he straightened, took a long breath, and turned to Mrs. Farrow, who had pressed herself against the wall and was holding her hymn book very tightly. "Madame," he said, "you have had a great shock. Please, do not move from this spot, and please do not allow anyone else to come near." He paused. "Can you do that for me?" She nodded, wordlessly, which was remarkable for Mrs. Farrow. Poirot walked quickly to Dr. Hollowell, who was still near the church door. He touched his arm and spoke in a low voice. Hollowell's face changed. He said, "Good God." "Yes," said Poirot, "precisely. We must have the constable, and we must, very calmly, if you please, ensure that no one leaves the churchyard for the present." "The bells," said Hollowell. He meant that no one would have heard anything. The bells would have covered everything. A struggle, a cry, the brief, terrible sounds that must have accompanied what was done in that corner of the churchyard. "Yes," said Poirot again. He looked up briefly at the tower, where the bells were still ringing, solemn, indifferent, mathematical. The bells. Within 20 minutes, the churchyard had taken on the particular quality of unreality that descends upon an ordinary place where something extraordinary has happened. People stood in clusters, speaking quietly. A few of the women were crying, more from shock than grief. The Reverend Fossey had gone very pale and was sitting on the church steps with his hands between his knees. The constable, a young man named Briggs who had clearly never seen anything more serious than a bicycle theft, had arrived and was trying to look authoritative while being conspicuously out of his depth. Poirot moved among them quietly. He noticed first that Mrs. Constance Hartley had been found near the church door and told the news by Dr. Hollowell himself. She had received it without collapsing, without crying, without any of the expected performances of a wife newly widowed. She had sat down on a tombstone, which struck several people as strange, and said, very quietly, "I see," and then nothing more. He noticed, second, that Roger Ashby had gone white and then, after a moment, faintly red, in a sequence of colour changes that Poirot found rather more interesting than grief alone could account for. He noticed, third, that Miss Eleanor Vane was not crying. She was standing very straight near the lych gate, her green coat perfectly buttoned, her face entirely composed. She was watching the activity around the body, with an attention that was, Poirot thought, very nearly professional, and he noticed, fourth, that Arthur Poole, coming down from the ringing chamber, with the other bell ringers, when the ringing finally, mercifully stopped, had looked at the scene in the churchyard, and gone immediately to the ivy gate, and stood with his hand on it for a long moment before Constable Briggs told him to come away. Poirot filed all of this carefully. He also made, in that first hour, one small error, though he would not recognize it as an error until considerably later. Watching Roger Ashby's face, that flush of emotion following the pallor, Poirot decided that Ashby was the most likely candidate for what had been done. The financial difficulty, the broken friendship, the avoidance, the sleepless look that morning, it all assembled itself, in Poirot's orderly mind, into something that resembled a picture. He was wrong, but he did not know that yet. The inspector from the county arrived at 1:30. His name was Craddock, a solid, experienced man who had the useful quality of not being condescending to Poirot, whom he had heard of, while also not being quite foolish enough to defer to him entirely. "The bells," said Craddock, standing over the body, which had now been photographed, and was awaiting the police surgeon, ringing the whole time. "From 9:30 until the service ended," said Poirot, "and then again for the recessional, from approximately 11:15. The second ringing lasted perhaps 12 minutes, and the body was found during that second ringing. Yes, the congregation was outside, in the churchyard. The bells were making considerable noise. It would have been difficult to hear anything." Poirot paused. "Or to be heard." Craddock looked at him. "You're saying whoever did this planned it." "I am saying," said Poirot carefully, "that whoever did this knew the bells would ring. And knew for how long, and knew exactly where, in this churchyard, a person could not be seen from the gathering crowd." He gestured toward the yew tree, the angle of the wall. "From the church door, from the lych gate, from any of the places where people naturally stand after a service. That corner is invisible. The tree obscures it. The wall obscures it. You would have to walk specifically to the bench under the yew to see it." "Which nobody would do," said Craddock, "because it's the farthest point from the church hall, and everyone was heading for the hall." "Except Mrs. Farrow," said Poirot, "whose feet trouble her." They were both quiet for a moment. "This was not impulsive," said Poirot finally. He said it not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, the first line of a problem that extended a long way further than he could presently see. This was arranged by someone who knew this village, knew this churchyard, knew these bells. He looked up again at the tower. Someone who had been here, in this place, long enough to understand exactly what the shadow of the bells could conceal. Craddock wrote something in his notebook. "That description," he said, "fits about half the people who were standing outside this church this morning." "Yes," said Poirot, "it does. The bells that hid everything." Inspector Craddock was a methodical man, and methodology produced the following picture. Gideon Hartley had been strangled. The police surgeon, Dr. Pembridge, brisk and detached, confirmed it within the hour. Manual strangulation, both hands. Someone of reasonable strength, or someone in the grip of a feeling strong enough to substitute for it. Death had occurred between 10:55 and 11:25. The second bell ringing had begun at 11:15 and lasted until 11:27, when Mrs. Farrow found the body. "So it happened during the bells," said Craddock. "Almost certainly," said Dr. Pembridge, snapping her bag shut. That evening, Poirot spread Craddock's notes across the small desk in his room and read them twice. 63 people had been in the churchyard during those 12 minutes, moving from the church door toward the lich gate and the hall beyond. In a crowd, stopping to speak, wearing good shoes on uneven ground, 3 or 4 minutes to cross the space. That left the murderer 8 to 10 minutes unaccounted for. Enough time. Strangulation does not require long. But the murderer had also needed, in those same minutes, to approach Hartley without alarm, lead him to the far corner, do what was done, and return to the moving crowd, looking entirely normal. "The approach," Poirot murmured. "How does one approach a man in a churchyard, in daylight, surrounded by 60 people, without being remarked?" The answer was that one does not approach him. One is already beside him. He reconstructed the morning. The congregation had left through the south door and gathered in the south section of the churchyard. The larger section, containing the older graves and the paths toward the lich gate, the far corner, with the yew tree and the ivy gate, was at the north end. To reach it from the south door, one walked the full length of the churchyard, past the newer graves and around the yew. There was no reason to go that way, unless one intended specifically to go that way, which meant either Hartley had gone there on purpose, or he had been persuaded by someone he trusted, or, and this was the thought that held Poirot longest, he had gone there to meet someone, by arrangement. Before the morning had even begun, a churchwarden does not walk to the hidden corner of his own parish churchyard during the feast day without a reason. His duties, his wife, his congregation, all required him to be visible, central, present. Someone had asked him to be there, and that something was connected to the wrongness Dr. Hollowell had sensed settling over Ashford Crossing for months. He turned to the question of the gate. The ivy gate in the north wall was not visible from the lane, the south door, or the lich gate. It was visible only from the far corner itself, and from the field beyond. The gate was old, with a simple iron latch, and it opened without sound. He had tested this on Saturday, pushing it gently with one finger. It moved silently. The hinges had been oiled, and recently, old gates in old churchyard walls are not, as a rule, oiled. They are left to rust and announce themselves. This one had been silenced, deliberately, and not long ago. He wrote this down. He also wrote, in his small leather notebook, the following names: Mrs. Constance Hartley, no tears, I see. Sat on tombstone, Roger Ashby, pallor, then flush, kept hands in pockets, did not speak for first 20 minutes. Miss Eleanor Vane, watching the people around the body, not the body itself. Arthur Poole, went directly to the ivy gate when he came down from the ringing chamber. Reverend Fossey, pale, sitting, hands between knees, appeared genuinely distressed. He looked at the list, then added underneath, Ashby, financial motive, broken friendship, sleepless, most probable. He underlined it, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who has identified the correct answer. He was wrong. But the little grey cells had not finished their work. There was one element of the bells that still troubled him. Arthur Poole, the chief ringer, who set the pace and called the changes, had told Constable Briggs that the second ringing had started 3 minutes earlier than planned. Why? Briggs had asked. Because I looked out the chamber window and the congregation was already coming out. So, we started. Briggs had written it down and moved on. To Briggs, it was a logistical detail. To Poirot, it was not. If the ringing had started 3 minutes early, then anyone relying on the bells as cover would have had 3 unexpected additional minutes of noise. 3 extra minutes in which the churchyard was both full of movement and entirely deafened. This meant one of 2 things. Either the murderer was simply lucky, which Poirot was disinclined to believe, given the evident planning, or the murderer had known the ringing might start early. And the only people who could have known that were the ringers themselves, or someone who had spoken to Arthur Poole before the service. He wrote this down too. His last thought before sleep concerned the ivy gate again, but from a different angle. The gate opened inward, into the churchyard. To oil the hinges, a person would need to be inside the churchyard, with the gate closed. Not difficult, but requiring privacy and a moment when no one was watching the north end, which meant the gate had been prepared before Sunday. Not that morning. The murderer had come here earlier, stood at this gate, oiled these hinges with intention, looked at the yew tree and the bench and the angle of the wall and calculated, yes, here, this is where it will happen. All of this before Gideon Hartley was dead, before perhaps Hartley himself had any idea what was being arranged for him. Poirot lay in the darkness and thought about a person who plans, who calculates, who stands at an iron gate in a churchyard wall and oils the hinges quietly in the early morning or the dusk, and then goes home and waits, and on Sunday dresses for church, and walks up the lane with everyone else, looking perfectly ordinary. Such a person is not merely dangerous. Such a person is cold, and cold people were the most difficult to find. They did not make the warm, visible, traceable mistakes that passion produces. They left behind only the clean and careful shape of what they had done. He closed his eyes. Sleep, when it came, was not restful. Poirot asks questions. Monday morning arrived in Ashford Crossing with the particular English reluctance of a grey sky that cannot quite decide whether to rain. Poirot ate his breakfast at Hollowell Cottage, toast, which was acceptable, and something described as marmalade, which was not, and then put on his coat and his hat and went out to ask questions. He had a method, and the method was this. He did not ask the questions he wanted answered. He asked, instead, the questions that allowed people to talk. People, in his experience, could not be extracted like a cork from a bottle, pulled at directly until they gave. They had to be tilted, gently, until what was inside them found its own way out. He began with the Reverend Fossey. The vicarage was a Victorian house of considerable draughtiness, set back from the lane behind a garden that had once been orderly and was now making its own decisions. The Reverend Martin Fossey answered the door himself. He had no housekeeper on Mondays, and stood in the doorway looking at Poirot with the eyes of a man who had not slept. "Mr. Poirot." "Yes. Hollowell mentioned you might call." He led Poirot into a sitting room crowded with books, not arranged by subject or author, but simply accumulated, stacked on surfaces and along the floor, with the comfortable disorder of a man who reads to live rather than to appear cultured. Poirot approved of this, quietly. "A terrible business," said the Reverend, sitting down and then immediately standing up again and going to the window. "Gideon Hartley, in my churchyard, during the feast." He shook his head. 22 years I have been in this parish. Nothing like this." "You knew him well," said Poirot, accepting the chair he was offered. "As well as one knows any churchwarden. He was efficient, dedicated. The fabric of this church, the parish accounts, the organization of the calendar, All of that rested largely on his shoulders, and he carried it without complaint. Fossey paused. Whether I knew him as a man, that is a different question. You did not find him easy to know. I found him complete. The Reverend chose the word with care. He presented a complete surface. There was nothing in his manner that invited one to look further. Most people, when you speak with them, leave small openings. Questions they have not answered, things they have not said. Gideon rarely did. He turned from the window. Does that make sense? It makes a great deal of sense, said Poirot. He let the silence sit for a moment. Tell me about Agnes Poole, he said then, lightly, as though it were an afterthought. Something crossed the Reverend's face, quickly, and then gone. Agnes Poole? Yes, she left in June. You were her vicar. Did she come to you before she left? A pause. Fossey sat down at last. She came to me in May. She was distressed. She said she needed to leave Ashford Crossing, and she asked me whether I thought it was wrong to run from something rather than to face it. And what did you tell her? I told her that sometimes wisdom and retreat are the same thing. He looked at his hands. I have wondered, since, whether I advised her well. She did not tell you what she was running from? No, she would not say. I had the impression. He stopped. Please, said Poirot gently. I had the impression that she was afraid of what she knew rather than what had been done to her, as though she had discovered something. And the discovery itself had become dangerous. He looked up. I am not a detective, Mr. Poirot. I may be entirely wrong. You are not entirely wrong, said Poirot. One more question, if you will permit. During the second ringing yesterday, where were you standing? Near the south door, speaking with Mrs. Annesley about the harvest supper. She will confirm it. I do not doubt it, said Poirot. And he meant it. He had, in truth, already removed the Reverend Fossey from his mental list of serious candidates. The man's distress was too genuine, too unguarded. Killers who planned as carefully as this one had planned were not distressed. They were composed. He thanked the Reverend and left. He found Roger Ashby at Barton Grange, in the garden, doing the sort of vigorous and unnecessary deadheading that indicates a man who needs to do something with his hands. Ashby looked up when Poirot came through the gate, and his expression moved through several positions before settling on something wary and controlled. Mr. Poirot, I expected the inspector, not you. Inspector Craddock will come in his own time, said Poirot pleasantly. I am merely a visitor, a curious one, I confess. Ashby set down his secateurs. He was wearing old clothes, the kind a man of his background keeps specifically for the garden, and he looked, Poirot thought, considerably less composed than he had in church. The sleepless quality was still there, deeper now. I suppose you want to know about my friendship with Gideon, he said. If you are willing. Ashby led him to a bench at the edge of the lawn. Not the deliberate kind of invitation, but the automatic movement of a man who suddenly does not trust his legs to carry him indefinitely. He sat down. Poirot sat beside him. We were friends for 8 years, Ashby said. Good friends, I thought. He advised me on the estate accounts when I first came back from London. He knew everyone in the county who was worth knowing. He was generous on the surface. On the surface, Poirot repeated. Ashby was quiet for a moment. Last autumn, I discovered that Gideon had known, for 2 years, that my estate manager was falsifying the accounts. Taking money. Not a great deal, but steadily. He said it without drama. Gideon knew and said nothing to me. I don't know why. Perhaps he thought it not his business. Perhaps. He stopped. Perhaps what? Perhaps he had some hold over Fenwick, the estate manager, and wished to keep it. Gideon collected things. Information. He was very good at knowing things about people. Ashby looked at the garden. When I found out that he had known, I confronted him. He denied it, very smoothly, and then suggested that perhaps I had misunderstood Fenwick's records. It was done so well that I almost doubted myself. He paused. After that, I could not be in the same room with him without a feeling I would rather not name. You need not name it, said Poirot. I understand it perfectly. He did. It was the particular cold anger of betrayal, not by an enemy, who is expected to betray, but by a friend, who is not. Where were you, said Poirot, during the ringing yesterday? Ashby looked at him directly. I was near the Lich Gate, with Tom Birch, as it happens, the old verger. We were discussing his wrist, which is healing. You may ask him. I shall, said Poirot. He asked it in the same light tone he used for everything, but inside, the note he had made on Sunday evening. Ashby, financial motive, broken friendship, sleepless, most probable, had begun, faintly, to trouble him. Miss Eleanor Vane received him in the small sitting-room above the village school, which smelled of chalk and old wood, and the particular tired sweetness of rooms where children spend their days. She had made tea without being asked, which told Poirot something about her. She was a woman who prepared, who anticipated, who thought 3 steps ahead as a matter of habit. She was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but she had a quality of precision about her, in the way she sat, the way she poured, the way she looked at him, that Poirot found, despite himself, rather impressive. You are investigating Gideon Hartley's murder, she said. Not a question. I am asking questions, said Poirot. That is the same thing. She handed him his tea. What would you like to know? Tell me, said Poirot, what you know about Agnes Poole. It was, he admitted to himself later, a slight miscalculation. He had meant to approach the subject gradually, but something about Miss Vane's directness had drawn him to match it, and he had played his hand a little sooner than was ideal. But Miss Vane did not flinch. She set down her own cup and folded her hands and said, I wondered when we would get to Agnes. You knew her well. She was my friend, a genuine one, which are not easy to find in a village of this size. Her voice was even, but there was something careful in it, the evenness of control rather than the evenness of calm. She came to me in April, 3 months before she left. She told me that she had found something out. About Gideon Hartley. Poirot set down his cup. What had she found? She would not tell me entirely. She said it was safer that I didn't know. She was frightened, Mr. Poirot. Agnes was not a frightened woman by nature. To see her frightened was… Miss Vane paused. It was wrong. It was like seeing the wrong weather in the wrong season. But she gave you no indication of what she had discovered. Miss Vane was quiet for a moment. That went on slightly too long. She said that Gideon Hartley was not what he appeared. She said that someone had been hurt because of him, and that he had made sure no one would ever know it. Someone had been hurt, Poirot repeated. Did she say who? No. And you believed her? Without question. Miss Vane looked at him steadily. Agnes did not imagine things, Mr. Poirot. She was the most literal person I have ever known. If she said someone had been hurt, then someone had been hurt. Poirot nodded slowly. Then, as though it were a merely practical matter, where were you standing during the second ringing yesterday? By the east path, she said, without hesitation, between the Kellaway grave and the elm. I was speaking to no one. I was thinking. About? A brief pause. About Gideon Hartley. Before or after you knew he was dead? Miss Vane looked at him for a long moment. Before, she said quietly. I had seen him walking toward the north end of the churchyard as the bells began, and I remember thinking, where is he going? This landed quietly, but it landed hard. You saw him walking toward the north end, said Poirot. And did you see anyone with him, or following him? No, she said. He was alone when I saw him, but I only watched for a moment. Then Mrs. Annesley spoke to me, and I turned, and when I looked back, he was gone around the yew tree. She looked at her hands. I should have followed, she said. I had the thought that I should follow, and I did not. Poirot said nothing. There was nothing to say. He spoke to Arthur Poole last. He found him at the Three Crowns, not drinking but sitting at a corner table with a glass in front of him that had not been touched. He was a big man. Agnes's brother with her same quality of literal, unornamental presence, but where Agnes had apparently worn it lightly, Arthur wore it like weather. It sat on him, grey and heavy. He looked at Poirot when Poirot sat down across from him, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation and is neither relieved nor frightened that it has come. "You want to know about my sister," he said. "And about the gate," said Poirot. Arthur Poole looked at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," said Poirot simply. "You went directly to the gate when you came down from the ringing chamber, before you had been told anything, before you knew where the body was." A long silence. The pub was quiet around them. It was not yet noon, and the light through the small window was the colour of weak tea. "I oiled it," said Arthur Poole at last. Poirot waited. 3 weeks ago, at dawn, I oiled the hinges." He looked at the table. "Because I had arranged to meet someone there, at the gate, someone who had information about Agnes, about why she left." He raised his eyes. "She wrote to me in July. Agnes did. She said she had gone because she had found out something about Gideon Hartley, something that she thought could destroy him if it came out. She said she was afraid he knew she knew, and that as long as she was in Ashford Crossing, she was not safe. And the person you arranged to meet at the gate, who was this?" Arthur Poole's jaw tightened. "It was Gideon Hartley." Poirot was very still. "I had written to him, anonymous letter. I said I knew what Agnes had found out, and that I wished to discuss it. Privately, I chose the gate because it's out of sight. I chose the feast day because everyone would be together, and no one would think it strange if either of us was briefly absent." He looked at his untouched glass. "I wanted to confront him. I wanted him to admit what he had done to drive my sister from her home." "And did he come?" "I never got there," said Arthur Poole. "I was in the chamber, the ringing. I couldn't leave in the middle of a peal. You can't simply stop, not with 6 bells. It takes everyone working together to end it properly. And then by the time we came down..." He stopped. "He was already dead," said Poirot quietly. "Yes." Poirot sat with this for a moment. It rearranged several things he had been holding in a particular order. "The anonymous letter," he said. "You asked him to meet you at the gate. At what time?" 11:15, when the bells started. 11:15, when the second ringing began. And Hartley had been seen walking toward the north end of the churchyard as the bells began. He had gone to the gate. He had gone because Arthur Poole's letter had asked him to. But Arthur Poole had never arrived. Someone else had. Poirot stood up slowly, his mind very quiet and very quick, the way it became when things that had seemed separate began to show their connection. Someone had known about the letter, or someone had, entirely independently, chosen the same time and the same place, which was not credible, which meant the letter had been seen, or spoken of, or... He put on his hat. "Mr. Poole," he said, "that letter you sent to Gideon Hartley, did you tell anyone that you had sent it?" Arthur Poole looked up. "One person," he said slowly. "I told one person, because I needed to talk to someone who had known Agnes, who understood why it mattered." "And who was that person?" said Poirot. Arthur Poole's answer was a single name. Poirot heard it, and something settled into place in his mind, with the quiet, definite click of a well-made lock. "I see," he said. He said it the same way, he realized as he walked back out into the grey Monday morning, that Mrs. Constance Hartley had said it when she was told her husband was dead, quietly, without surprise, as though it confirmed something already known. The little grey cells begin to work. Poirot did not return directly to Hollowell Cottage. He walked instead, and walking, for Poirot, who did not walk for pleasure or exercise, was thinking made visible. He moved through the village at a pace that suggested a man with nowhere particular to be, and his mind moved at an entirely different pace altogether. The name Arthur Poole had given him was Miss Eleanor Vane. He turned this over without hurry. Miss Vane, who had been Agnes Poole's closest friend, Who had known about the anonymous letter that had brought Gideon Hartley to the north corner of the churchyard at precisely 11:15? Who had been standing alone on the east path during the second ringing, with a clear line of sight to the yew tree and no witness to her movements during every one of those 12 minutes? Miss Vane, who had told him, voluntarily and without prompting, that she had seen Hartley walking toward the north corner as the bells began, and had the thought to follow him, and had not. He passed the church. The tower was silent now, the bells hanging in their wooden frame in the darkness above, indifferent to what they had covered. He stopped at the lich gate and looked into the churchyard for a long time. He was guilty of a thing he rarely permitted himself, forming a conclusion before the evidence had finished speaking. Roger Ashby, with his pallor and his flush, and his broken friendship, Poirot had assembled these pieces into a picture and called it a portrait. The picture was wrong. Ashby's alibi was solid and unplanned. Men do not arrange alibi witnesses without visible awkwardness, and Ashby had named Tom Birch with the flat casualness of a man reporting weather. It had the texture of truth. More than that, Ashby's anger at Hartley was the anger of a man who had been wronged and carried it openly as a wound rather than a weapon. Poirot had seen enough of both to know the difference. That kind of feeling was too warm, too uncontrolled, to belong to the person who had oiled the gate and calculated and chosen the bells as cover. The person who had done this was cold, and Ashby was not cold. He crossed through the lich gate and walked slowly along the east path Miss Vane had described. He stopped between the Kellaway grave and the elm and looked toward the yew tree. He could see it clearly. The path leading to the north corner was entirely visible from here. Her account was accurate in that detail. He looked at the elm, at the reach of its branch, at the way it made a natural alcove. Then he looked at the ground on the side facing away from the path, toward the churchyard wall, and he stopped. The earth here was soft, from shade and roots. There were marks in it, not clear footprints, but the irregular, pressed-down quality of ground, where someone has stood still for some time, shifting their weight. Someone had stood here, hidden from the east path by the trunk of the tree. If you stood here, behind the elm, you could not see the path, but you could see, around the edge of the trunk, the north corner of the churchyard, the yew, the bench, the ivy gate. This was not the position of an observer. This was the position of someone waiting for the right moment to move. He thought, 2 people on the east side during the ringing. Miss Vane, on the path, where she said she had been, and someone else, behind the elm. Or 1 person, who had stood on the path long enough to be remembered there, and had then moved, quietly, around the elm, and… He stopped himself. The little grey cells required facts, not poetry. But he photographed the disturbed earth carefully in his mind and walked away. That afternoon, at Hollowell Cottage, he sat across from his old friend and organized what he knew. "Let us begin with Gideon Hartley himself," said Poirot. "Before we can understand who killed him, we must understand what he was. What had he done, and to whom?" "Agnes Poole," said Hollowell. "Agnes is the thread," Poirot agreed. "She discovered something serious enough to frighten her into leaving her home and her brother. She told Miss Vane that someone had been hurt because of Hartley, not a personal grievance, but a wrong done to someone else. And she told the Reverend she was afraid, not of what had been done to her, but of what she knew." He paused. Hartley collected information. According to Ashby, he used what he knew to maintain a web of obligation around him. The respectability was not an accident. It was the mechanism. A respected man is not questioned. Hollowell was quiet. Then, "There is something I did not tell you in my letter. 7 years ago, a young man left this village. His name was Daniel Marsh, the son of a woman who kept the tea room on the high street. He left suddenly. As Agnes left, his mother said only that he had gone to find work in the city." He met Poirot's eyes. "She died 4 years ago. At the end, she said to me, he had to go, without context, without explanation." "And you think Hartley was involved?" I think Gideon Hartley had something to do with why Daniel Marsh left, and I think Agnes Poole found out what it was." Poirot stood and walked to the window. The slightly wild roses, the wet stone path, the grey English sky. "You have been carrying this for some time, mon ami. I had no proof, only a feeling, and a dying woman's words. And you wrote to me, because you thought, if Hartley was what you suspected, eventually someone would not simply leave, someone would stay and do something about it." "I was afraid," said Hollowell quietly, "that it would come to this." Poirot turned from the window. "Tell me about Daniel Marsh. Everything you remember." Daniel Marsh had been a quiet, bookish young man who worked part-time in the church records office, the small room beside the vestry where the parish documents were kept. Birth records, death records, marriage registers going back 2 centuries. He had been meticulous with these documents. He had also, in the months before his departure, been unusually anxious. His mother had noticed. Hollowell himself, treating the boy for a chest complaint, had noticed. And Gideon Hartley had been, in those months, the church warden with direct oversight of the records office. Poirot listened. He thought about a young man with access to old records. He thought about a man like Hartley who collected information. He thought about what, in a village with 2 centuries of documented human history in a small room beside the vestry, might be found by someone who knew how to look, and what Hartley might have done with it. And he thought about Agnes Poole, who had also worked as a volunteer in that same records office the winter before she left. Hollowell mentioned this now, as an afterthought. Poirot filed it carefully. He also thought about Miss Eleanor Vane, Agnes's closest friend, who had known about the anonymous letter, who had stood on the east path during the second ringing, and who had told him with perfect composure, "I had the thought that I should follow, and I did not. The thought that one should follow, and does not. Or the thought that one should follow, and does, and tells no one." He rubbed the side of his nose. He needed one more thing, perhaps 2, but the architecture of the case was becoming clearer. The walls were rising. "Tomorrow," he said, "I should like to visit the records office." "The church will be open," said Hollowell. "Fossey leaves it unlocked during the day." "Good." Poirot picked up his notebook and closed it. "And I should like to speak once more with Mrs. Constance Hartley." Hollowell looked at him. "You think she knows something?" "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that she has known a great deal for a very long time. A woman who receives news of her husband's murder and says, 'Only, I see,' is not a woman shocked by news. That is the response of a woman who has been waiting for an ending and has finally received one." He paused. "The question is whether she knew which ending it would be." A wrong turn. Tuesday morning began with rain. It came in quietly, the way English rain often does, not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply arriving in the night and still being there in the morning, as though it had always intended to stay. Poirot stood at the bedroom window of Hollowell Cottage and watched it move across the garden in thin grey curtains, and felt, not for the first time in his career, the particular unease of a man who thinks he knows where he is going and has begun to suspect he may be walking in the wrong direction. He had slept badly again. The grey cells had refused to rest. The problem was Miss Eleanor Vane. He had constructed, in the long, careful hours between midnight and 4, a version of events that placed her at the centre of everything. It was elegant, it was logical, it accounted for the gait, the timing, the knowledge of the letter. She had been Agnes Poole's closest friend. She had known about Arthur Poole's plan to confront Hartley. She was intelligent, precise, capable of the kind of cold planning the murder required. She had been on the east path, alone, during the critical minutes, with a view of the north corner and no witness to her movements during every moment of those 12 minutes. It was a good theory. It had the satisfying completeness of a well-fitted garment. And yet, there was a thread, a small, persistent thread that pulled at the garment's hem and would not be ignored. Miss Vane had told him, voluntarily and without prompting, that she had seen Hartley walking toward the north corner. She had told him this before he had any particular reason to focus on her. A guilty person as intelligent as this one, does not volunteer information that places them as a witness to the victim's final movements. A guilty person controls what they say, adds nothing unnecessary, gives the minimum. Miss Vane had given more than the minimum. Either she was innocent, or she was so extraordinarily clever that she had calculated exactly how an innocent person would behave and replicated it perfectly. Both possibilities troubled him for different reasons. He ate his toast, he drank his inadequate tea, he put on his coat against the rain, a fine coat, rather wasted on this kind of weather, and walked to the church. The records office was, as Hollowell had promised, accessible. It was a small, low-ceilinged room to the right of the vestry, with a single narrow window and wooden shelving running along 3 walls from floor to ceiling. The shelves held the accumulated paper record of Ashford Crossing's human existence, register after register, bound in leather and cloth, their spines labelled in the careful handwriting of various parish clerks going back to 1731. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment. The room smelled of old paper and dust, and the particular melancholy of recorded endings, births, deaths, marriages, all the formal markers of lives that had long since concluded. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for, but he had learned, in 40 years, to trust the instinct that brought him to a room. The instinct was rarely wrong, even when its reasoning was not yet clear. He began with the most recent registers and worked backwards. For 40 minutes he found nothing that seemed relevant. Then, in a register covering the years 1931 to 1948, marriages, he found something that made him stop. It was an entry for June 1944, a marriage between one Gerald Aubrey Marsh and Florence Ann Ketley. He read it twice. Then he stood very still with the register open in his hands. Florence Ann Ketley. He put the register down and went back to the shelves. He found the death register for the same period. He looked for Florence Marsh, née Ketley. He found her in 1951. Cause of death, recorded as heart failure. She had been 31 years old. He stood there in the thin morning light from the narrow window, and he thought about a woman dead at 31, leaving behind a husband and, presumably, a young son. Daniel Marsh would have been a child. He thought about Gerald Marsh, who had presumably raised Daniel alone. He thought about Daniel Marsh, who had worked in this very room, with these very registers, under the oversight of Gideon Hartley. And then he looked for Gerald Marsh in the death register. He found him in 1953. Heart failure again. He had been 54. 2 heart failures. Husband and wife. 7 years apart. Poirot replaced both registers with great care, turned off the small lamp he had been using, and stood in the dimness for a moment, thinking. He recognized, building a structure on incomplete foundations. 2 deaths recorded as heart failure in a rural village in the 1950s did not, in themselves, constitute evidence of wrongdoing. People died of heart failure. Doctors in small villages, stretched thin and lacking the resources of city hospitals, sometimes recorded heart failure when the truth was more complicated. This was not sinister. This was simply the imprecision of medicine at a certain time and place. And yet, Daniel Marsh had worked in this room. Daniel Marsh had seen these registers. Daniel Marsh had left suddenly, having presumably seen, or been shown, or been told, something that frightened him. And Gideon Hartley had overseen this room, these records, for 20 years. What was in these registers that Hartley had not wanted known? He went back to the shelves. He needed the medical records, but those would not be here. They would have been Hollowell's predecessors, destroyed or archived, or simply lost. He needed the inquest reports, but rural inquests in the 1940s and 1950s were often perfunctory, their records scattered. He spent another 20 minutes. He found nothing conclusive. He left the records office and stood in the vestry, frustrated in a way he did not often permit himself to be frustrated, not with the evidence, which was simply incomplete, but with himself, for not yet seeing the shape of what was there. He went, from the church, directly to make his mistake. Later, much later, after everything had resolved itself, he would describe it to Hollowell as a failure of patience. He had grown impatient with the incomplete picture and had reached for a conclusion before the evidence invited him to do so. He had done it once already with Ashby, and he had corrected it. Now he did it again, differently. And this time, the consequences were not merely theoretical. He went to see Miss Eleanor Vane, and he asked her, directly, whether she had gone to the north corner of the churchyard during the second ringing. He should not have asked it directly. Not yet. He had not enough. Miss Vane looked at him across the small sitting room, with its chalk smell and its pale morning light, and her expression did not change in any way that was visible, and she said, "No, you did not move from the east path. I did not. And you saw nothing further after Hartley disappeared around the yew tree. Nothing," it was said with perfect steadiness, perfect composure. And Poirot, sitting across from her, felt the sudden cold certainty that he had made an error, not of deduction, but of method. By asking the question directly, he had told her what he suspected, and she was now prepared. He recovered as smoothly as he could. He talked of other things for a few minutes, the parish records, the history of the village, the rather fine elm in the churchyard. He was pleasant. He was unhurried. He gave nothing further away. But walking down the lane afterward in the thin rain, he permitted himself a single quiet expression of displeasure directed entirely at himself. It was brief. He was not, as a rule, self-indulgent about his errors. He had shown his hand, and the hand was not yet full. It was Constance Hartley who gave him what he needed. He had arranged, through Hollowell, to call on her at 2 o'clock. She received him in the drawing-room of Hartley House, the largest private residence in Ashford Crossing, handsome, well-furnished, cold, not the cold of the church, which was the cold of centuries. This was the cold of a house, in which warmth had, at some point, been decided against. Mrs. Hartley sat in a chair by the window that looked onto the garden. She was dressed in dark grey, not full mourning, but an acknowledgement. Her hands were folded in her lap, with the stillness of a woman who has had long practice in being still. She looked at Poirot without surprise. "I thought you would come," she said. "Ephraim told me you were thorough." "I try to be," said Poirot. He sat down. "I am sorry for your loss, madam." She received this with a slight inclination of her head that was neither acceptance nor rejection. Then she said, "What do you wish to know?" "I wish to know," said Poirot gently, "about Daniel Marsh." The stillness in the room deepened by a degree. "That," said Constance Hartley, "is a name I have not heard spoken aloud in a very long time. But you know it." "Yes." She looked at her hands. "I know it. Will you tell me?" She was quiet for a long moment. The rain moved against the window. In the garden, the roses, darker than Hollowell's, more formal, more controlled, were bending slightly in the wet wind. "Daniel Marsh's mother was my friend," she said at last. "My genuine friend. Ellen Marsh. We grew up together, she and I." She paused. "When Ellen's husband Gerald died, in 1953, when Daniel was 9, she managed alone. She was capable. She was proud. She did not ask for help easily." "And Gideon," said Poirot quietly. A long silence. "Gideon helped her," said Constance. "With the accounts, with various practical matters. He was very good at that, you understand. Making himself necessary. Making himself the person people could not manage without." Her voice was entirely flat. "And Ellen, she was grateful, dependent on his advice. And Gideon." She stopped. "He used what he knew," said Poirot. "He found something," said Constance, "in the parish records, about Ellen's marriage, about Gerald. There was a previous marriage. Gerald Marsh had been married before, very briefly, in 1938, before he met Ellen. Before the war, the first wife died in an accident in 1940, but the record of the first marriage was there, in this parish, because Gerald Marsh had been born here, had been baptized here. His family was here. She pressed her folded hands together slightly. Ellen did not know. She had married Gerald in good faith. But if the first marriage had not been properly dissolved before her marriage to Gerald, and it had not, there had been some legal irregularity that Gerald himself may not have fully understood, then Ellen's marriage was not valid. And Daniel, she stopped again, was illegitimate, said Poirot quietly. In 1953, in a village like this one, said Constance Hartley. That was not a small thing. No, it was not. In 1953, in a small English village, the illegitimacy of a child, even one who was entirely blameless, even one whose parents had acted in complete good faith, was a thing that could mark that child for the remainder of his life in that place. Gideon knew, said Poirot. Gideon knew, and he held it. Not openly, he would never do anything openly, but Ellen knew that he knew. And she became very careful around him, very accommodating. She did whatever he required of the household accounts, of the church arrangements, of various small favors. Constance's voice had not changed in tone throughout any of this. It was the voice of a woman reporting facts from a very great distance. She died, as you perhaps know, in 1967. Daniel had left some years before. He left because Gideon told him privately, in the records office. Daniel told me this himself. In a letter he sent me after he left, Gideon told him that he had the power to make what he knew public, that he had copies, that if Daniel did not leave quietly and permanently, he would ensure that the truth about Daniel's birth became common knowledge in Ashford Crossing. The room was very quiet. He blackmailed him, said Poirot, not as a question. He removed him, said Constance, the way he removed anything that threatened his position, his respectability, the careful image he had built. She looked up at Poirot for the first time since she had begun speaking. Agnes Poole found Daniel's letter in the records office. She had not been looking for it. It had been misfiled, years ago, in among some old vestry papers. She read it. She understood what it meant. And she came to me. Poirot was very still. She came to you. Yes. Last April, she sat in this room, in the chair where you are sitting now, and she told me what she had found. And she asked me what I wished her to do with it. And what did you tell her? Constance Hartley looked at him steadily. I told her, she said, to go. A pause. I told her to take the letter and to go somewhere safe and to say nothing. I told her that I would handle it, that I had been waiting to handle it for a very long time. The rain against the window. Poirot looked at this woman, 63 years old, dark grey dress, hands folded, roses bending in the garden behind her, and understood with sudden and absolute clarity that he had been wrong about the cold. He had described the murderer as cold, and Mrs. Hartley was not cold. She was the opposite of cold. She was a woman of deep and long-contained feeling that had been compressed. Over 40 years of a marriage she had endured, rather than chosen, into something very dense and very quiet and very, very dangerous. Madam, he said carefully, I must ask you where I was during the bells, she said. Yes, she said it without fear, without calculation. She said it the way a person says something they have been rehearsing for some time, not to deceive, but simply because they have lived with it so long it has become automatic. I went to him, she said. While the bells rang, I had asked him to meet me there. I told him I knew about Daniel Marsh, that Agnes had found the letter, and that we needed to speak privately before the feast day service. I arranged it by note, delivered to his study on Saturday morning. Poirot said nothing. He waited. He came, she said. He came because he was afraid of what I knew. He thought I wished to make a bargain with him, as Ellen Marsh had made bargains, as Daniel Marsh had been forced to make a bargain. He thought I wanted something from him, and would be, like the others, manageable. She looked at her hands. He was wrong about that, she said. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Hartley, he said slowly, I think you should say nothing further to me. I think you should— No, she said gently. I think it is time for things to be said. And she said them. Under the shadow. The truth revealed Wednesday arrived clear. The rain had gone in the night, leaving behind it the particular washed brightness of an English morning after a storm. The air sharp. The colours of the village more definite than usual, every stone and leaf and garden gate standing out with the slightly unreal clarity of things newly rinsed. It would have been, under other circumstances, a beautiful morning. Poirot rose early. He dressed with his usual care. More care than usual, in fact, which Hollowell, who knew him, would have recognized as a sign. When Poirot was most precise about his appearance, he was preparing for something that required him to be completely himself. He had telephoned Inspector Craddock the previous evening. He had said, very quietly, that he believed he knew what had happened in the churchyard on Sunday, and that he would be grateful if the inspector could arrange for certain persons to be present at Hartley House at 11 o'clock on Wednesday morning. He had given the names. Craddock had been silent for a moment. Then he had said, All of them? All of them, said Poirot. Another silence. You're certain? I am, said Poirot. Nearly certain. Which in this case is sufficient. He had not slept badly on Tuesday night. The architecture of the case was complete. The walls were standing. He could see the whole of it now. Not merely the shape, but the interior. The small rooms within rooms, where the truth had been living for a very long time, before it finally, violently, made itself known. They gathered in the drawing-room of Hartley House at 11 o'clock. It was the same room in which Constance Hartley had received Poirot the previous afternoon. The same window, the same formal roses in the wet garden, the same quality of cold. But the room was different now, filled with people, and with the tension that precedes an unmasking, which is a tension unlike any other. Not the tension of danger, but the tension of truth approaching. Inspector Craddock stood near the door, with the stillness of a man professionally accustomed to waiting. Constable Briggs was beside him, notebook ready. Roger Ashby sat in a chair near the fireplace, his hands on his knees, looking at no one. He had come because Craddock had asked him to come, and he had the appearance of a man who does not know what he is about to hear, but is fairly certain it will be unpleasant. Miss Eleanor Vane sat near the window, her hands folded in the same precise way she always held them. She was watching Poirot. She had been watching him since he entered the room, with an attention that was neither hostile nor afraid, but rather the concentrated regard of someone who has decided to see everything clearly. Arthur Poole sat slightly apart from the others, large and still, his weathered hands resting on his thighs. He had come because Craddock had told him his presence was required. He had not asked why. The Reverend Fossey stood near the bookcase, not leaning against it, simply near it, as though he needed the proximity of something solid. And Constance Hartley sat in her chair by the window, the same chair, Poirot thought, where she always sat, in the same dark grey dress, with the same folded hands. She was looking at the garden. Poirot stood at the centre of the room. He did not pace. He did not perform. He simply stood, and when everyone had settled, he began to speak in the quiet, unhurried way of a man who has earned the right to be heard. I will begin, he said, not with Sunday, but with 1953. Several people looked at each other. Craddock did not. He had been briefed, partially. In 1953, said Poirot, a man named Gerald Marsh died in this village. His wife Ellen had died 2 years before him. They left behind a son, Daniel, who was 9 years old. Daniel Marsh grew up in Ashford Crossing, and when he was 22, he worked in the parish records office of St. Bartholomew's. And during that time, he discovered something, or rather, something was discovered for him and used against him. which caused him to leave this village and never return. He paused. What was discovered was this: Gerald Marsh's first marriage, contracted briefly in 1938 before the war, had never been legally dissolved at the time of his marriage to Ellen. The first wife had died, but the legal process had been irregular, incomplete. This meant that Ellen's marriage to Gerald, entered into in entirely good faith, was technically invalid, and Daniel, their son, was, in the formal and cruel terminology of that era, illegitimate. The Reverend Fossey made a small sound, quickly suppressed. This information, said Poirot, existed in the parish records. It required someone with knowledge, with patience, and with a particular appetite for the useful secrets of other people to find it and understand its significance. Gideon Hartley had all three of those qualities. The room was very still. He did not publish what he knew. He never published anything. That was not his method. His method was private, quiet. He held the information over Daniel Marsh, told him privately in the records office that he had copies, that he could make it known. He told Daniel to leave Ashford Crossing quietly and permanently, and Daniel, who was 22 and alone and frightened, did so. Poirot let this sit for a moment. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Gideon Hartley had been doing this for years, finding things, holding them, using them to maintain a web of obligation and dependency around him. It is why he was respected. It is why no one questioned him. It is why Roger Ashby, when he confronted him about the estate manager's dishonesty, was met with smooth denial rather than accountability. Hartley was not merely a respected man. He was a man who had made himself untouchable by ensuring that those around him had reason to keep his goodwill. Roger Ashby, across the room, was very still. Something in his face had loosened. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a man hearing his own private understanding, confirmed publicly for the first time. Last April, said Poirot, a woman named Agnes Poole was working as a volunteer in the parish records office. She found, misfiled among old vestry papers, a letter. The letter was from Daniel Marsh, written before he left, addressed to a person in this village who he trusted, setting down, in full, what Hartley had told him and what had been used against him. He looked at Arthur Poole. Your sister, Mr. Poole, was not a woman easily frightened, but what she read in that letter frightened her. Not for herself. She had done nothing wrong. She was frightened because she understood, immediately, what kind of man Gideon Hartley was. And she understood that a man like that, who had driven a young man from his home with a secret held over him like a blade, would not be comfortable with her knowing it. Arthur Poole's jaw was set. He nodded once. Agnes took the letter. She came to Mrs. Hartley. Every head in the room turned, almost involuntarily, toward Constance. She did not look up from the garden. She told Mrs. Hartley what she had found, and Mrs. Hartley told her to go, to leave Ashford Crossing, to take the letter, to be safe. Mrs. Hartley told Agnes that she would handle the matter herself. Poirot paused. Agnes also told one other person, her closest friend, Miss Vane. Miss Vane, at the window, did not move. And Miss Vane, who is a precise and intelligent woman, told one more person. When she heard that Arthur Poole intended to confront Hartley directly, using an anonymous letter, she told him what Agnes had actually found. The full weight of it. Poirot turned to Arthur Poole. She advised against direct confrontation. She told you it was not the right method. She told you the situation was already being handled. Arthur Poole looked at Miss Vane. Something passed between them. An acknowledgement, silent and private. But Arthur Poole sent the letter regardless, said Poirot, asking Hartley to meet him at the Ivy Gate at 11:15 on Sunday. And this is where the case becomes, as the English say, complicated. He moved slightly, not pacing, simply reorienting himself in the room. Let us speak of Sunday morning. Gideon Hartley received Arthur Poole's anonymous letter. He did not know it was from Poole. He knew only that someone claimed to know what Agnes had found, and wished to meet him privately at the gate during the feast day. He was not afraid. Men like Hartley are rarely afraid of private meetings. They are accustomed to managing such things. He intended to go to the gate, discover who had written the letter, and manage them as he had managed others. He also received, on Saturday morning, a note from his wife, delivered to his study. The note told him that she knew about Daniel Marsh, that Agnes had found the letter, and that she wished to speak with him privately during the feast day. Craddock, near the door, was watching Constance Hartley carefully. "Two private requests," said Poirot, both referencing Agnes Poole, both asking for the same moment, the feast day, when the bells would be ringing and the congregation outside and no one watching the north corner of the churchyard. He looked at the room. Hartley was not a stupid man. He may have wondered whether the two requests were connected, but he went. He went because he had no choice. Both messages told him that people knew what he had done, and he needed to deal with that. "He went to the gate," said Poirot quietly. He went at 11:15 as the second ringing began, and he found, at the gate, not Arthur Poole, who was in the ringing chamber and could not leave, but his wife. The room was entirely silent now. Even the garden outside seemed to pause. "Constance Hartley had been at that gate before Sunday," said Poirot. "She had oiled the hinges, not Arthur Poole, as I initially assumed when I heard he had gone to the gate upon coming down from the chamber. She had gone there in the early morning of the preceding week, and she had oiled the hinges so that it would open without sound. She had stood in that corner and measured the distance and the angles and the obscuring of the yew tree. She had planned it with the thoroughness of a woman who has had 40 years to think about what she would do if she ever found the courage." He stopped. He looked at Constance Hartley. "Madam," he said gently, "you told me yesterday that you went to him, that you had arranged it, that he came because he thought you wished to make a bargain." He paused. "And then you said he was wrong about that." Constance Hartley looked up from the garden. She looked at Poirot directly, with clear, steady eyes. "He was wrong about that," she said again. "You did not wish to bargain," said Poirot. "No, you had decided, long before Sunday, long before Agnes brought you the letter, perhaps many years before, that if you ever had the evidence, the clear and documented evidence of what he was, then you would not bargain. You would end it." A silence that lasted several seconds. "Yes," said Constance Hartley simply. The Reverend Fosse had sat down at some point without anyone noticing. Roger Ashby was looking at the floor. Arthur Poole had closed his eyes briefly and then opened them again. Miss Vane was looking at Constance Hartley with an expression that Poirot could not entirely read. It was not shock, and it was not quite grief. It was something closer to the complicated sorrow of a person who has, on some level, already known. "Mrs. Hartley," said Inspector Craddock, stepping forward now, doing his duty with the careful decency of a good man in a difficult position, "I must ask you formally." "You need not ask," said Constance. "I will tell you everything. I have been intending to tell someone for 3 days. It is rather a relief, if I am honest." And she did. She told it without drama, in the same flat, factual voice she had used with Poirot the previous afternoon, as though she were reporting events that had happened to someone else, which, in a sense, they had. The woman who had walked across the churchyard under the cover of the bells, who had met her husband at the ivy gate, who had looked at him and seen 40 years of quiet endurance, and Ellen Marsh's face, and Daniel Marsh's letter, and Agnes Poole's frightened eyes. That woman was connected to the one sitting in the chair, but she was not quite the same. She had told him what she knew. She had told him that she had the letter, that Arthur Poole knew, that Miss Vane knew, that Agnes was safe and would speak if required. She had told him that it was finished, that the careful architecture of secrets and obligation he had built over 40 years was coming down. And Gideon Hartley, who had managed every difficult conversation of his adult life with smooth and practiced control, had not managed this one. He had lost, For perhaps the first time in 40 years, his composure. He had reached for her, not with tenderness, not with contrition, but with the cold instinct of a man who has always handled threats by eliminating them, and she had been ready for that. She had been ready for that for a very long time. Craddock did what he was required to do, and he did it with a quietness that Poirot respected. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no handcuffs applied with unnecessary emphasis. Constance Hartley rose from her chair with the dignity of a woman who has decided how she will conduct herself, and she conducted herself accordingly. As she reached the door, she paused. She turned and looked at Poirot. "The letter," she said. "Daniel Marsh's letter. Agnes has it. It should be returned to Daniel, if he can be found. He deserves to know that it no longer matters, that it has been resolved." "I will see to it personally," said Poirot. She nodded. Then she walked out of the room and the house and into the clear September morning. And Constable Briggs walked beside her, and the roses in the garden did not notice at all. The room was quiet for some time after she had gone. It was Miss Vane who spoke first. "She told me," she said, "to no one in particular, to everyone. On Saturday evening, she told me what she intended. I tried to—" She stopped. "I could not have stopped her." "No," said Poirot. "I do not think you could." "She had been married to that man for 40 years, said Miss Vane. "She had watched what he did to Ellen Marsh, and to Daniel, and to Agnes, and to Roger Ashby, and to others, perhaps, that we do not even know. She had lived inside it. And she had—" She pressed her lips together briefly. She had chosen a long time ago that if the moment came, she would not step aside. Arthur Poole stood up. He looked at Poirot. "Agnes," he said, "she'll be safe now." "She will," said Poirot. "She may come home if she wishes." Something in Arthur Poole's face, large, weathered, contained, shifted briefly into something very much like relief. Then it settled again, and he nodded, and picked up his cap from the table, and left without ceremony. Roger Ashby sat for another moment. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, he'd known about Fenwick for 2 years. He said it without heat. It was simply a thing that, now, needed to be said aloud. He knew, and he held it, and he used it, and I called him my friend. He was very good, said Poirot, at presenting a complete surface. Ashby looked at him. Then he almost smiled, a bleak, tired smile, but genuine. Yes, he said, he was that. He stood and left. The Reverend Fossey lingered a moment. He looked at Poirot with the eyes of a man reassembling something that has been broken. "What will happen to her?" he asked. "That," said Poirot, "will be for others to decide. Not I." Fossey nodded. He understood. He was a man who believed in mercy, but also in the human necessity of consequence. He left quietly, pulling the door gently closed behind him. Poirot stood alone in the drawing-room for a moment. He looked at the chair where Constance Hartley had sat, at the window, at the garden beyond, where the roses bent and straightened in the morning wind. He thought about what justice looked like when it came from inside a life rather than from outside it, when it was not administered but enacted, personally, by the person who had been nearest to the wrong and had waited longest for the writing of it. He did not approve of murder. He never had. The law was the law, and the law existed for good reasons, and a man of his profession could not endorse the circumvention of it, however sympathetic the circumstances. He believed this. He had always believed it. And yet, he was also, underneath the precise suits and the little grey cells and the methodical arrangement of facts, a human being. And human beings, when confronted with 40 years of quiet suffering and the slow, systematic destruction of weaker people by a man of absolute respectability, human beings feel things that are not always entirely consistent with their principles. He felt them now. He acknowledged them, and he set them aside. He picked up his hat from the table where he had placed it upon entering. He looked once more at the garden. "Eh bien," he said quietly, "to the empty room. It is finished." He found Hollowell in the cottage garden, doing something purposeful with the slightly wild roses that Poirot had never understood but had come to associate with the man's particular way of thinking. Hollowell looked up when Poirot came through the gate. "Well," he said. "It is done," said Poirot. He sat down on the small wooden bench that faced the garden, not elegantly, but with the tiredness of a man who has been carrying something and has now set it down. "You were right, mon ami. The village was not quite right." Hollowell came and sat beside him. They were quiet for a moment. Two old men in a garden. "Constance," said Hollowell. It was not a question. "Yes." Hollowell was silent. Then, "I should have seen it. She has been... I have known her for 30 years. I should have seen what she was carrying." "We do not see it," said Poirot. "In the people we have known longest, we see instead the image we have built of them over time. The image and the person, they are not always the same." "No," said Hollowell, "they are not." The roses moved. Somewhere in the village, a door closed. A dog, briefly, complained about something and then stopped. "Will you stay?" asked Hollowell. "Another day or two." Poirot considered the train to London, his apartment, his proper coffee, his tisanes, the view from his window that was not roses and stone walls, and an English sky pressing its grey thumb on everything. He considered all of this. "Yes," he said. "Another day or two." Hollowell nodded. He went back to the roses. And Poirot sat in the September garden in the village of Ashford Crossing and rested and let the little grey cells which had worked very hard be quiet for a while. Above the village, invisible now, the bells of St. Bartholomew's hung in their dark tower, still and silent. They would ring again for another feast, another Sunday, another gathering of the ordinary human lives of this small and secret place. They would ring, as they always had, for everything and nothing, for prayer and for grief and for the plain, persistent fact of time moving through a place and leaving its marks, indifferent, patient, ancient, as the bells always are.